All right. John mentioned part of the book that we told you about yesterday of Joint Chief Chairman Mark Milley's concerns about a possible coup by former President Trump and his allies after the 2020 election. Yesterday, Trump put out a statement in response to those revelations, writing, quote, "I never threatened or spoke about to anyone a coup of our government. So ridiculous. Sorry to inform you, but an election is my form of coup. And if I was going to do a coup, one of the last people I would want to do it with is General Mark Milley, Michael Schmidt." Here we go again. At the same time, this is a really, really dangerous moment for our country, that there isn't a uniform, just absolute agreement that there was a man in charge who incited a riot against our U.S. Capitol, our Constitution, our democracy in process. How much does this match a lot of the reporting that you've been doing?
And that was like sort of a classic Trump response there as a way of, taking a shot at Milley and also sort of, throwing himself into this discussion about the coup in the way that he did. It flashbacks to sort of the Trump tweets. Look, all of these accounts are really stark and really scary because we saw, all of us, how close we came to the edge and what that insurrection was and how that was such a manifestation of everything that Donald Trump had done over 4 years. What I keep on finding that I think we sometimes forget or miss is that a lot of these people who, found themselves in dangerous places like Mike Pence or, others were people that for 4 years had been around Donald Trump and knew about his possibilities. They were enablers of Donald Trump. Mike Pence helped Donald Trump get out of the Mueller investigation. Mike Pence stood around silently many times over the 4 years that Donald Trump was president, and didn't say much and didn't do much to hold the president accountable. There's accounts of Bill Barr that have come out about, different things that Bill Barr did or said. There was no greater enabler of Donald Trump than Bill Barr. So I understand the importance that these individuals played in the historic moments after the election and how the country was on its edge. But these were folks that were still there after 4 years of Donald Trump being president. These were people that had seen the president act up close. I guess some of them thought they needed to be there to stop Trump from hurting himself and hurting the country. And I understand the unusualness of that phenomena. But, at the same time, I don't think many of us were surprised by Donald Trump's behavior after the election.
And Casey, right in the middle of this week when we're getting these breathtaking excerpts from Carol Leonnig and Phil Rucker's book about what happened leading up to January 6th, what happened on that day, and what happened afterward, you would think it might give some Republicans pause. And yet the House Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, yesterday was at Bedminster, President Trump's golf club, meeting with him, kissing the ring, even as we're hearing these stories, and even as just on Sunday at CPAC, former President Trump said what we saw in those images was a group of patriots, that they were peaceful, and in his words, on January 6th, love was in the air. So full denial from Donald Trump, full denial from Republicans, and even the leadership of the Republican Party still going to make sure they still have Donald Trump in their pocket.
Yeah, it continues to be stunning, Willie, for sure. And of course, while the official accounts of the meeting yesterday between McCarthy and Trump say that they didn't talk about selections for the January 6th special committee that's going to look into this, we know that McCarthy has been involved in the decision-making process there, and there's been this sense on the Hill that under no circumstances is he going to select those people without making sure that the former president is on board with what he does here. And I would just underscore a couple things. I mean, first of all, we've learned so much from these accounts, but there is also a lot that we don't know because we have reporting, contemporaneous reporting from that day about, for example, the call that we know occurred between the president and Kevin McCarthy. there are a lot of questions about what was said there. Who else was calling the president? I know Democrats are very interested in getting copies of the president's phone records. Whether that's going to be possible is an entirely different question. Democrats are going to meet with the Department of Justice, which, of course, has been investigating the riot itself, to see what kind of evidence they can get their hands on. That'll tell us a lot about that day. And just to circle back to Mike Pence, as he's in the Capitol, and there is eventually an angry phone call from Pence to the White House, he's huddled in this room, and the only person that can call off these people is the former president, Donald Trump. And one of the most evocative pieces of evidence we have for this is I did an interview with a Capitol police officer who was in one of those doorways, who was injured by the mob, had to take several weeks off of work. And he said he was, as he was confronting these rioters who were trying to push past him and get into the Capitol, he said, come on, like, you have to listen to me. And they said back to him, we're here because President Trump told us to be here. He's the only one we listen to. We don't listen to the police. We don't listen to law enforcement. We listen to President Trump. That's why we're here. Mm-hmm. And that shows you the importance of what Trump himself was going to say and do on that day. That's why the tweet that he sent out seemed so half-hearted and people were so disappointed by it, because he was, again, the only one that had the power to actually say, OK, I'm going to keep Mike Pence and all these other people safe. So that's what the stakes were.
So, I mean, this really shows what Casey's analysis shows us is the need for robust hearings, looking into every aspect of this. Because I want to focus on something Casey said, Trump being the only person who could have really called this off, John Hallman. It's just like so many of those people who were there and so many people across America. Trump is the only person who could inspire them to get the vaccine. And yet he doesn't. And therein lies the cult-likeness of the Trump following. That is such a danger to our democracy. It's not an exaggeration. This is how cult leaders act.
Yes. And I will go back to something Willie said a second ago, Mika, to answer that question. Then I want to ask Mike Schmidt a question going out of this. But, you know, Willie said that the Republican Party and Donald Trump were in full denial about what happened on January 6th. But he cited something that is much worse. And this goes to the cult leader point. You know, what Trump is now doing is something much, much more insidious and much more dangerous than being in denial. It was bad enough when Trump and others were saying that this was just that these are all happy revelers and it was the atmosphere of a picnic and they were just like normal Capitol visitors, like trying to memory hole what happened on January 6th, even though we all saw it with our own eyes, even though we all can watch the 30-minute reconstruction that Mike's colleagues at the New York Times did in video. It's all out there, right? And here the Republican Party collectively, led by Trump, trying to whitewash it. But they're not trying to whitewash it anymore. Trump is now trying to turn this into a glorious moment of patriotism. He's now trying to do a full Orwellian inversion. And, you know, the whole thing of now trying to turn Ashley Babbitt into a martyr is another part of that. That is going in a much more, I mean, the memory holding is incredibly dangerous to the country when you have tens of millions of Republicans who believe the election was illegitimate. But to try to characterize this as a glorious moment, a righteous moment, is 10 times worse. And it leads me, Mike, to this question, right? Because it connects up to this other thing, which is at this moment after the election from November 7th all the way through to January 6th, you know, if on this program and other places, when people would express the view that we were worried about what Donald Trump might be doing at the Pentagon with his personnel changes, was he going to try to deploy the military for some political purpose? Was he going to try to hold on to power? If you had said the word coup on Morning Joe, the entire Republican Party would come down in your head and say you are a lunatic, Trump derangement syndrome driven maniac who's fantasizing, paranoid, all of that, right? Now we have learned that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was not just contemplating the possibility of a coup or Donald Trump trying to seize control of the military for his personal or political ends to try to extend his time in office. He was not just thinking those things. He was taking action on a daily basis on the presumption that that was where Trump was headed. And I guess the question I have to ask is it's crazy to even ask now whether Republicans have any shame But it is amazing to me that in this moment, as Mark Milley is revealed as having fought these things, done the things he did, along with Mike Pompeo and others in real time, that there is no collective, institutional grappling with that reality by Republicans. Is there not ever going to be a moment where someone on the Republican side looks up and says, yeah, you know what, we were wrong, and all of you who were most alarmed were in fact right?
I don't think so, especially because, as you were pointing out, the Republican Party has continued to follow Trump in this direction. There has not been any introspection, and those people who have wanted to look back, the Liz Cheneys of the world, have been ridiculed and exiled and shunned by the party. And the party has just continued to move in that Trump direction, even as Trump has seen his own approval ratings and his own popularity begin to wane. And there's sort of been a disconnect there in terms of, why is it that the Republican Party is continuing to follow him even if Trump's popularity is falling off. And I don't know if there will ever be anything that sort of changes the minds of this part of this bedrock part of the Republican Party, led by Leader McCarthy, about how they view Trump. Obviously, McCarthy still sees him as sort of a gatekeeper. They have followed what he wants in regards to this panel, this special committee that has been appointed to look at the events. It seems like they obviously don't want to go along with it, and they may want to put people on the panel that are going to be obstructionists to the entire thing.